Mayday, mayday, mayday. Bonanza 1957 Lima, emergency aircraft. I need to land.
497 Lima, Roger, Jackson International. It's here about 4 miles northwest of your position. You can have runway 32 up and advise if you need any assistance.
Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots like you to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Now, this may be one of our most important episodes to date, as you may learn one or two nuggets of information that could save your life if you have a total engine failure. That's what happened last summer to Boeing Experimental Test Pilot John Tougas, and today he shares what happened. As you listen, take note of not just the things that John did after the engine failed, but also the things he routinely does in flight, so he's prepared in case he does have an engine failure. In episode 183, we talked about the Garmin G3000 and G5000 glass cockpits and about my brand new book that teaches you these systems. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And since today's episode is so important, now would be a great time to share Aviation News Talk with your friends, because an engine failure could happen literally to any of us. And there may be things that you and your friends learn from this episode that could help you survive if you lose an engine someday. So if you're using the Apple Podcast app, just tap on the 3 dots at the bottom of the screen, which brings up the share button. Or if you're using a different app, just look for the share button in that app. Or if you prefer, just send a text or email to your friend and tell him or her to go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/184. Thanks so much for your help with this. And if you find value in this episode, please sign up now to support the show by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal to join the small percentage of listeners who take that 3, maybe 4 minutes of time it takes to sign up to support the show. And Patreon members have already had access to the video version of this interview where you can see John's photos of his event. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Now let me tell you a little bit about John Tougas, military call sign Toonsis. John is a Boeing Experimental Test Pilot based at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, and he flies the F-18 Super Hornet, the EA-18G Growler, and P-8A Poseidon aircraft, performing research and production testing. He's also Boeing's lead airshow pilot in the FA-18, and he has more than 4,000 hours of time in over 40 different aircraft. He's a former naval aviator, and he has a BS and a master's in aerospace engineering. Now here's our conversation with John Tougas. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into it. Tell us about the mission you were flying that day that had the incident.
Okay, the mission was to return home from Naples, Florida. Home for my aircraft is Whiskey 26, which is in Maryland. And the planned fuel stop for that was Rocky Mount Wilson Airport in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. So it was about a planned 3-hour leg with 5 hours of fuel on board. And the weather check the night before showed VFR the whole way. And the morning forecast showed VFR the whole way. And of course, when I got airborne, all that changed. And so the game plan was, in my aircraft, I like to fly either at 8,500 or 9,500. If I'm VFR, if I'm IFR, it'll be 9,000 or 10,000, depending on where the weather is, all things being equal. But it was I typically go IFR, and I had filed for 9,000 feet and was given 5,000 feet on my clearance. 6,000. I'm not sure why, because I was headed east, but they gave me 6,000. They told me to expect 6,000. All right, so the main reason why I file for those altitudes, there's 2 reasons. One is efficiency, and one is I have options in case something's wrong with the engine. So that was the mission. I was alone. I was ferrying back a couple items from my mother's house. I visited my mother. She was home alone all during COVID, hadn't been visited by anybody. So I had gone down there and spent some time with her. And I was coming home to see my family.
So tell us, what kind of aircraft were you flying and how was it equipped, and what other portable gear did you have on board with you?
Okay, it's a 1976 Bonanza F-33A, so that's the straight tail. Has IO 520. I have a vacuum and electric gyro. It has no real glass. The GPS is a 430 WAS, and it's got ADS-B out. I always fly with not one but 2 iPads for flight loaded on board. And I always fly with a Stratus, and that's usually plugged in. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, I stopped using paper a long time ago, but the other is for redundancy. So everything was loaded up in both the 430 on board and in both my iPads. I had them synced up. So those are my tools, both for pre-flight and during in-flight.
So what was the first sign that you were having a problem?
I'll get to that in a second. A little background. So my iPad is an iPad mini on purpose. This is a dual yoke aircraft. And in between the yokes is where I take the magic mount, magnetic universal ball joint mount, and put the iPad. So the iPad is literally when you're holding the column, if you stick out your right pinky, you can almost touch the screen. So it's that close and that easy and that accessible. And all the other instruments are on the standard location. And then the Garmin 430 is over in front of the right column. The aircraft is equipped with an engine monitor, which I fly with a lobster stare. So lobsters can move their eyes in separate directions. One eyeball is always on that engine monitor or in and around the engine cluster. And the other eyeball does everything else. I'm exaggerating, but you understand why when you fly single engine aircraft, why you need to do that. This aircraft was about 25 hours out of annual, and it was running smooth like a baby. It was what was unusual was I was leveled off at 5,000 feet by Miami Center for traffic, and this is launching out of Naples. So I'm a good 150 miles from Jacksonville, and they still won't let me get higher, even though despite my request. So I had leaned the engine. I fly about 50 degrees lean to peak per the manufacturer's procedure. And like I said, I stare at that monitor and I look at each cylinder temp, both the cylinder head temp and the exhaust gas temp. And I'm staring at that fuel flow. And that's what I'm doing when I'm not looking at where do I go if something happens right now. And I repeat that loop. Where do I go? What happens to something right now? That loop is in my brain, probably 1 or 2 seconds apart. Repeatedly the whole flight. The first sign of trouble was about an hour into the flight. I got a vector from Jacksonville approach. I'm clear back on course. And as I started, I used the GPS and the autopilot to turn everything. I'm an autopilot cripple. The reason is autopilot allows your brain to process other information without having to, concentrate on airmanship. I just use the autopilot. So I spun the heading around to the rough heading, found the intersection I was cleared to, hit direct and the start couple. And I felt the engine, there was a tiny little burp and it was less than a second. And it was the kind of burp you experience when you try to crank a hot engine. Right after you shut it down, you try to crank it right back up. If it doesn't quite catch, you get a little right there instantly is when I knew something was wrong. Several other indicators started cascading after that incident, but it's one of those things where if this thing's purring along, I haven't touched the mixture, I hadn't touched the throttle, I've been on autopilot and I've been steady state. And actually I'm only an hour into the flight. And like I said, I topped off in Naples and I always top off unless gross weight's a factor, knowing that I have at least 2.5 hours in each tank. So I knew it wasn't fuel starvation at that point. So I was triggered by any little burp, and that's exactly what it showed up as, that something was wrong. And I'm turning to my nearest emergency landing location right now.
And that burp, did the engine then go back to normal, or did it really quit immediately after that burp? In other words, did you have any kind of warning this was coming or not? None
whatsoever. None. As a matter of fact, I can remember seeing 1,450 degrees in cylinder number 1, 1,430 degrees in cylinder number 2. I noticed number 3 was a little bit hot, and I had that level of detailed memory right before this incident. And then when that little burp happened, my first reaction was pickle off autopilot. So hit the disconnect switch on the control column, start fairly aggressive level turn at this point. And then my other thumb mashed on the microphone, and I declared emergency. Throughout Mayday calls, declared an emergency, and said I need to land right. And this was about a 60-degree turn, and it was at least probably about 2 times standard rate turn rate that I put on, a good 45 degrees angled bank. And that's what saved me, actually, or allowed me, enabled me to pull off what I did. So after that little burp, then the engine just sounded like it started losing power. All right, then I started executing the procedures. Typically the book says, fuel's the problem. So richen it up, hit the boost pump, switch to fuel tank. Maybe it's the mags, but, I got to those 2 steps. Actually, when I flipped on the boost pump, things got more rough. So if you do something and it makes the situation worse, undo that something. And that's what I did. And at that point, so that was done with my right hand. The switch is in the center. That was done with my right hand. At that point, the whole aircraft started shaking so violently, it was hard to read the instrument panel itself. Instrument panel was shaking, numbers were hard to read. And I knew right away, all right, that's not a fuel problem. That's not a timing issue. That's not a spark issue. That's something mechanically wrong. So I knew something bad was wrong. And that was confirmed when I saw the EGTs go through the roof. So they went through the roof and then they dropped like a rock. So the exhaust gas temperature just basically stopped on all cylinders. Basically stopped. I saw one of the CHTs go through the roof, and I think it was the number 3. And then I pulled the data later and confirmed, yep, that was it. So I knew something mechanical was wrong just from the vibration and from the nature of what was going on. And that this was all within about 6 seconds or so of that initial little burp. And I knew, okay, well, there's no way this engine's coming back to life no matter what I do.
Let's go back to your point where you said you turned 45-degree bank essentially to get on a heading to Jacksonville. Explain to people why that was so important that you made that initial turn fairly steeply initially.
Well, like I said, Max, the point at which I need to point the airplane at any moment in the flight is always there's a constant bearing pointer in my mind, if not on my iPad or in the GPS. And what my game plan is it's going to be a max performance turn, assuming you're going to lose the engine. So there's 2 things you don't want to do. You don't want to pull too hard, and you don't want to pull too late. There's the Goldilocks pull. And I actually discussed this with a Naval Academy professor. The conversation started with, okay, what's the turn back altitude? And of course, the answer is, it depends. Okay, so if you figure out what the turn back altitude is, how do you turn back? And the answer we both agreed, he's a former test pilot, was you need to maximum perform the aircraft. So you need to achieve the best turn rate near the lift limit, but not over it. And so how do you target that? Well, you're going to have to compromise. All right. And so all the training I did when I got my Bonanza checkout, which was back in 2015 with this gentleman who's a professor, he's literally a doctor in this stuff. We did things a little bit differently. And, he knew my background and things like that. So 45 degrees is a good compromise between getting the turn performance you want without sacrificing too much airspeed. Because if the engine stops right there, now you're a glider. All right, now you cannot afford to pull a whole lot of G's because you're not going to have any power to get energy back. So that's why I used 45 degrees. I still had, the propeller was still turning when I rolled out of the turn. And then it wasn't long thereafter that the propeller, it didn't just slow down to a stop. It suddenly locked to a 12 and 6 position.
Yes, certainly if you had done something like a standard rate turn, it would have taken you much longer to get on the heading, and that would have been a longer distance you'd be flying, which would be less of a chance to make it to the airport. When the propeller stopped, did you notice any kind of change in your aircraft performance?
Let's see. I had about a 500 to 600 feet per minute descent prior to the propeller stopping. And then when it stopped, it increased to about 900 feet per minute rate of descent. And the book says you can expect somewhere around that range, but the book is also spec'd on max gross weight. Keep in mind, I had no passengers. I had minimal cargo, maybe, if you add it up, maybe 150 pounds plus another 160 pounds is really all I had. Plus I had 5 hours of fuel minus an hour. And so I knew that I probably had a little bit more. I could probably stretch it. The worst thing you can do is stretch too much. But I ended up, and I looked at the data afterwards, turned out about 800 to 850 feet per minute was about the max range glide in my configuration, my condition with a locked prop. So normally, if you're expecting a power loss, you're going to want to feather that to a low drag configuration. I didn't have that opportunity, and that prop angle changes, right, with the oil, right? Well, nothing's moving, the oil pump's not running, then nothing's going to change that prop. It's supposed to default to a low drag configuration. It was actually post-flight showed is intermediate. It wasn't high drag. It wasn't really all the way low drag. It was intermediate.
And tell folks how far you were from the airport and what you did after the prop stopped and you continued to the airport.
Okay. Well, according to Mr. Garvin, it was about 7 miles. I made the turn, rolled out. It was about 6.5 to 5 miles when I looked down. At this point, I had stated my intentions to land at Jacksonville. Well, I stated my intention. I need to land immediately. And, this started at 5,000 feet. And by the time I rolled out, I was at max glide range for the published engine out configuration of 121 miles per hour. And then I subsequently decelerated to a little bit less than that, knowing that I'm not max gross weight and I have a little bit more. So by the time I got on conditions, on max glide conditions, I was 4,000 feet. I was IMC. There were layers in between, so there was somewhat of a discernible horizon. And after fiddling with spinning the Garmin 430 big knob all the way to the right, finding the nearest, punching it in, that just was too much of a workload. I was told, Jacksonville's IMC, ILS approach, runway 26 in use. So a whole bunch of information that really wasn't what I needed, but the controller did a fantastic job of just telling me what I needed. The other piece that really helped me, and I'd say would be the key to success, is the situational awareness for flight. This iPad, it was, like I said, it's a pinky width length, I should say, away from my right hand. All I did is I tapped with my pinky K-Jax, which is right there just next to my flight path. So the whole iPad is right here. So I'm literally just tapping on the pinky, show airport diagram. There it is. And it's overlaid on the map. So I see my aircraft symbol. By the way, ForeFlight's got this fantastic feature, the glide advisor. So the glide advisor, if you enter in, go into flight manual, it'll show you the glide ratio of your aircraft from your flight operating handbook. If it doesn't show that, it will just say, okay, if you've got, X number of feet, you can glide Y number of miles. You can do a math and create a radio and plug that in. And ForeFlight will real-time calculate, and including factoring winds and ground speed, and show you graphically, I call it the butt print, of where you can glide to. So it includes places behind. So obviously you glide further if you just go straight ahead than if you do a 180. But that's why it looks like a butt print. But it also incorporates wind. So if there's no wind, it almost looks like a perfect heart shape. But I saw the glide advisor ring was tangential to the airport. So I knew I was on the hairy edge of being able to make it. But tweaking the glide speed, which I start at 121 miles per hour, I've got a miles per hour airspeed indicator in this aircraft. I think I bottomed out at about 105. Okay, so that actually stretched my glide just enough to make it to runway 32. Coincidentally, the turn I made was from about 030 heading when the first burp occurred to about 330 direct to the airport. So that was about a 60-degree heading swing. And it took the controllers to give me about 2 vectors to line me up and put me exactly where I need to be.
Take a moment and explain to people how best glide changes based on weight, because I think so many people just think of best glide as one number.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. So the best way to think about it is in the extreme. Okay. So, aerodynamically, you need to generate lift. You generate zero lift, you'll be falling like a rock. And lift is generated by speed, right? So if you're in let's say a 500-pound hang glider and you're cruising along and it glides at, let's say 40, 50 miles per hour, or you can use the kite example, okay? And the kite's in the wind. What happens if you put a 2-pound on a kite? Okay, it's obviously going to sink. Well, is there a way to make that kite not sink? Yeah, you can run fast. All right, same thing in the airplane. If the Bonanza I was in had, say, 4 people and we all had, heavy suitcases on us maxed out gross weight, I would have had to glide a lot faster to get more air over the wings to generate more lift to keep me airborne. Otherwise, I'd be coming down like a rock. So simply put, speed is lift, and lift needs to oppose weight, which is, being pulled down towards the earth. That makes sense.
Yeah. So at lower gross weights, you've got a lower glide speed, and sometimes that's spec'd and sometimes it's not. So obviously that really made the difference, I guess, you knowing that you could fly at a lower than published glide speed.
Well, that, and I had some glider training during my duty days in the Navy. I was fortunate enough to get selected to go to Naval Test Pilot School. And they teach this in theory. They teach you equations, and then you go out and you see those equations come to life. And so, we did some gliding right here, not far from where I live in Maryland, and some Schweitzer gliders where there's not a lot of thermal activity in southern Maryland. We also did some gliding out in Tehachapi, California, where there is a lot of thermal activity, and you can stay airborne for a long, long time. And so that training, there were a whole bunch of sequences and events in my background and history that suddenly, I don't know how, subconsciously maybe, aided me throughout this whole 5-minute, 6-minute evolution.
There was a time when the controller said descend and maintain 1,700. I would imagine that there are some pilots who, in your situation, would have said roger and descended to 1,700. Explain what you did in that circumstance.
It's interesting. Some people react differently when they're under duress and extreme pressure. I actually internally chuckled and said, roger, I'm a glider. So in the Navy, my Navy training, I was a fighter background. We were told you need to be concise and clear on the radio. No extra comms. Think about what you're going to say before you actuate the mic switch. Say it concisely and clearly, and then get off the mic and clear the air so someone else who has something important to say can speak up. And so there was, all that process occurred to me, in a short time span. I said, roger, I'm a glider. And I didn't think, I didn't know how well received it would be. And the whole point of that transmission was to instruct the controller, advise the controller that I really have, God's controlling my altitude right now. There's not a lot I can do about it. But upon debrief, it turns out that was helpful information to him. And so since he had help information, he was able to help me.
Yeah. And of course, if you just kind of instinctively followed what you were told to do and descended to 1,700, you would have never made it to the airport.
That's right. I missed that point. And there would have been a temptation. In fact, I was tempted when I was told ILS runway 26 use approach and use. Would you like vectors to base leg? And initially, I think I may have even said, maybe on the tape somewhere, I may have said yes. And then I immediately said, well, that's dumb, unable. And I may have made a jink right and back to the left. But in a pressure situation, you're never really going to know how you react till you get there, unless, and I think this is a super important takeaway, is you train under pressure. If you train, everything's easy, conditions are easy, or you always get that friendly, kind instructor to give you your annual or biannual, you're not applying pressure on yourself. That's not going to help, especially in a situation like this.
So it sounds like you essentially got them to vector you straight to the numbers. Is that what you did?
Well, it's as if, it's almost like we had time to think about it. What would be the best course of action? Evaluate those courses of action. And it seemed like they came the controllers came to the same, because they worked as a team, same conclusion as I did. My initial game plan was, I'm just going to make it to the airport environment.
Right.
Number one, I'm in Florida, so min-safe altitude is not a huge concern. What is a huge concern to me are, collateral damage with civilians and property and large pine trees. So the game plan was get my glide advisor ring to put me at least in the airport environment so I can find, non-structures to set the airplane down in, whether it's grass or a field or flat terrain or taxiway. And so I was just pointing literally at the airport symbol. And it was Harry that gave me the timely and just enough, not too much, nudge to the left to get me to, I swear, one little hole in the cloud layer opened up just enough for me. And it was at right 2:00, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the terminal at Jacksonville International. So if I knew that if I'm looking at the terminal at my right 2:00, runway 32's got to be over here. And Harry at the last second said, okay, you're over the approach end at 32. And I trust him. I nudged the nose over a little bit and right at about, I estimate about 900 feet, and weather history confirms that. I popped out, and I kid you not, Max, if I rolled knife edge, I would look down and see runway 32 right below me. I've never been talked down so precisely. We have a lot of talk downs in the Navy, especially at the ship at night, and they're trying to talk you into wires that are spaced 32 feet apart, and there's only 4 of them, and those wires are on a deck that are moving. They're not just pitching up and down. They do the Dutch roll thing, so it's multi-axis movement, and we have controllers that are the best in the world. And I ended up contacting Harry, and I said, you've got to be a CATSI controller, carrier air traffic controller, because only those guys, they're the only guys in the world I know that are that precise and that good and that cool under pressure. And he said he wasn't, and I was really surprised. Even his voice sounded like a CATSI controller, because naval aviators, tailhook aviators that are out there in Europe know this, that when you check in with approach at night and you're hooked down and you hear some of these voices, it almost has a calming, soothing effect psychologically to get your heart rate down so that you can use your hands in an efficient manner and do what you need to do to get your aircraft on deck.
I agree. There's just nothing like the voice of a calming controller when, someone is in a situation where you've got to really focus on what you need to do in an emergency or some kind of abnormal situation. Let's take a moment now and listen to some of the ATC transmissions between John and that FAA controller with a calming voice, Harry Kaufman.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Bonanza 1957 Lima, emergency aircraft. I need to land.
97 Lima, Roger, Jackson National. It's your about 4 miles northwest of your position. You can have runway 32 up and advise if you need any assistance.
It's 060. I got engine loss.
97 Lima, if you just want to continue towards the field and try to pick up the field visually, suggest setting 320. I'll to your discretion. 97 Lima, it's to maintain 1,700.
7 Lima, Roger, I'm a glider.
97 Lima, we turned all the lights up at Jackson International, and that's setting you up for about 3 miles from runway 32 at Jackson International.
97 Lima.
97 Lima, once I make the turn, it'll be setting you up straight in for runway 32. 97 Lima, you're clear to land any runway you need, or you're setting up for straight in 32, right over the approach end right now. 97 Lima, you should be just over the approach end now for runway 32.
And what a great job. And I just love it when controllers clear you to land on any runway. That happened to me one time very early in my private flying career when I was flying out across country into Mercer County in Trenton, New Jersey, and I was just totally confused. And they said, clear to land any runway. And boy, that took off the pressure and made it easy. So when you broke out at about 900 feet over the numbers, what did you do next?
I did what every naval aviator does at the numbers, brake left. Okay, so that's very non-standard for anybody else. It's very standard for naval aviators. In the Bonanza, as you know, it's not like a Cessna where I can just stomp on a rudder, go wing down, top rudder, and come down like an elevator, and then stop the elevator, 10 feet above the ground and smoothly come into a flare and put it down. So, that was another dilemma I was faced with. I'm over the numbers at 900 feet on was it 9,800 feet? I forget off the top of my head. But it's a long runway. And by the way, 3.2 and 2.6 cross. So now I've got, the active duty intersection in front of me. What I do know is I'm going to live and the aircraft's going to be relatively okay. So at this point, I'm trying to avoid creating another hazard by incurring on an active duty runway. I didn't know that they had cleared out every single aircraft within about a 5-mile radius. So that's the other miracle. Harry was able to control 4 other aircraft on frequency, including a budding naval aviator. And student naval aviators are notorious for their unbelievably long and drawn out radio calls, because every single one of them has a 3x5 card, or probably now, a phone, of what they're supposed to say and how they're supposed to say it. And they're all nervous in saying it. And so despite all this traffic, he cleared everybody out. So I didn't know that I had the entire airport to myself. So I was trying to mitigate an additional risk, number one. Number two, at 900 feet in a glider at about 100 miles per hour, I knew I had the energy to do a 360 at this point. And in order to do a 360, I knew I had to keep it tight. In order to keep it tight, performance. In order to have that performance, I needed to lower the nose. So lowering the nose will increase airspeed unless you put it in a tight turn, and in which case you'll just maintain airspeed. So I lowered the nose and I didn't even need to look at the airspeed indicator. You can hear the wind when there's no engine running pick up. So I saw the airspeed head up a little bit. And that's basically when I wrapped it up to, it was probably about a 50-degree, 55-degree bank angle turn, and kept the turn radius maybe 2 runway width from runway center line. And when I rolled out, actually prior to rollout, I realized, well, shoot, I've got the runway made. Might as well put the gear down and save the belly of the airplane. So I put the gear down, and that's basically a speed brake in the Bonanza. And so even approaching the numbers and the threshold cross at 50 feet, I'm like, well, shoot, this looks familiar. About 90 miles per hour. I normally touch down at 65, 70. Might as well put the flaps down. So at 50 feet over the numbers, flaps came down, and then touchdown. The touchdown was normal. What caught my eye at this point was a whole bunch of flashing lights over to my right, basically following me. So I basically was in a formation of and 3 or 4 emergency response vehicles. They were on the taxiway parallel to me, and I had, like I said, spun the Garmin to nearest enter, and so it auto-pitted my COM1 with a tower frequency. And I told Tower, 97 Lima, I'm on the rollout and runway 32. And the interesting thing is they told me, you can clear at the next taxiway and shut down there. And I don't know if it made it on the radio tapes, but I said, well, I shut down 6 miles ago. Thanks. And I cleared on runway 32 taxiway Tango, I believe it was. And I arrived to a stop at the same time that the emergency vehicle stopped, basically right in front of my aircraft. And at that point, everything's silent. Nothing's moving. I do hear, the battery's still on. So I hear the whining, of the gyros. And I kind of snap out of it, said, okay, after landing checklist, flaps up, trim, all that. Okay, so I've got my normal checklist done. What about post-landing checklist for non-normal procedures? Okay, I need to secure the fuel, make sure mags, all that stuff, did that. And then I sat there and kind of stared straight ahead and figured, all right, now what? Normally I'd be shut down in FBO by now, but now what? And that's when I realized, okay, I had so much adrenaline coursing through my veins, and it's like the saber-toothed tiger's not chasing anymore, but I've got all the adrenaline going. So I tried to step off the wing onto the little step on the side there. And when I hit the ground, I looked up and there's the EMS team. They're all looking at me and they're all in a semicircle, all with their arms crossed, and they're just shaking their heads. And the guy to speak up was the ambulance guy, the medical guy. And he just smiles at me. He says, "You did it." And when he said that, I almost collapsed to my knees. And what's interesting, Max, is a lot of night traps went like that, where you were so focused on the task at hand, and then you trap. All right, the flight's not over until you get shut down, and then you get off the flight deck, get out of debrief, and then you get in your stateroom, and then same thing, your knees will collapse, and you think, well, you just need a good night rest. Well, good night rest doesn't come for another 3 or 4 hours. That adrenaline takes a while to wash away, and so that's exactly what happened to me. And another interesting thing, one of the fire guys said, "You a Navy pilot?" I said, "Yeah." "How'd you guess?" He's like, "Well, I saw you come out of the clouds and break left." Well, yeah, that's what we always do. So that's how it ended. Happily, fortunately.
So tell people, when you lost the engine and you were descending through the clouds, what instruments you lost in the airplane and what kind of backups that you had available to you.
Okay, so when the prop locked up, that instantly shut down the alternator and the vacuum pump. So I did have electric backup gyro, did have the turn needle, turn coordinator. The HSI was still pointed in the right direction. I cross-checked that with a wet compass. So again, that goes to a good instrument cross-check, because if you're cross-checking, you'll be able to see things ordinary as they happen. If you don't cross-check and something goes awry, you're less likely to pick it up. And the other, like I said, the iPad gives you instant, concise, complete essay, situational awareness of what was going on. And so, my main attitude tool was my electric gyro that helped me maintain level. I was able to maintain level visually too with some of the cloud layers, but I advise against depending on cloud layers. What they are is they're additional cues, but they're not dependable cues, because you can easily get false horizons. So cross-checking instruments, VSI, and practicing partial panel. I went into that mode. It basically just, you flip a switch, you go to partial panel mode. But if things seem to be stable, there's no reason why you can't cross-check other items in the cockpit. And I relied heavily on that ForeFlight to precisely navigate that, and the approach controller got me to where I need to be able to execute a visual maneuver once I got overhead the runway.
Obviously, you used a lot of the processes that you learned through training, and checklists are an important part of that. Tell us what you used from a checklist standpoint. Was it mostly from memory, or did you actually pull out checklists?
Yeah, so good question. I've got printed checklists both on the iPad. I've got the laminated ones, and I've got the aircraft operating manual. And what I do is the laminated one, I print that out, and I use a red border to indicate that those are the immediate actions or the memory items for that aircraft. And I fly 3 different aircraft for a living, by the way. And so I do that for all aircraft I fly. And in the Bonanza, it all the critical action procedures concisely fit on one sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper. And so before I even start up, In fact, a lot of times on the way to the airport, I review that top to bottom. And so it becomes indeed a memory item. And the problem with memory items is it's hard to practice them under duress. So you have to practice them when there isn't pressure over and over and over so that you can just go to, okay, what is the third step of engine fire and flight or electrical fire? You need to be able to map it in your mind so you can precisely grab it out instantly when you need it when you're under pressure. Because just because you can say it, in a 0-knot 1G environment in your living room, top to bottom, doesn't mean you can do it when you're actually airborne. And so that's what I do at aircraft before every flight. I'm going to do a memory item review.
Wow, that's fantastic. I bet there are a lot of people that don't review memory items before every flight. Now, have you always done that, or is that even more important because you're flying a lot of different aircraft?
That was taught day one in flight school in the Navy. And so what was interesting is the type of aircraft you were able to select at a flight school was highly dependent on your grades. Your grades were highly dependent on your performance in the simulators in flight. And that was highly dependent on how you demonstrated mastery of certain skills. And the instructors that I had zero tolerance for missing any memory item at any time. So every single flight, every single brief, you would have the emergency procedure of the day, and you have a memory item of the day. And if you didn't know that, and you wouldn't be thrown out right away, but guess what? That is a deficiency that gets marked on a grade sheet. And so you've got a stack of grade sheets. And so it was my goal. I wanted fighters from day one. I wanted single seat fighters from day one. It was my goal to get that. And I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that I got, because I'll admit I'm not the best stick in the world, and I don't have the greatest memory in the world. So I have to compensate. And so I compensated by making sure that there's no way I'm ever going to get dinged on missing a memory item, in a brief ever. And so that has stuck with me.
That's great. I think what you're saying essentially is you just try to work harder than everyone else so that you do perform well.
Yeah, that's all it was. That's what I was taught by my father. Hard work pays off. Always. Doesn't matter what your innate talents are. You work hard enough, you'll get to where you want to go.
I totally agree. I think that's a great philosophy. Well, you've had a lot of time to think about this. Looking back, is there anything that you can kind of point to and say, well, yeah, maybe I would have done something differently if it happened again?
The only thing I can think of is I wish the weather was a forecast. It was forecast for VFR sky clear. So, that's actually a good lesson, is you're always going to be lied to. All right. It's no ding on weathermen, but assume they're always wrong, and they will be. And so I have changed things since this incident. For flight, nicely color codes. When you look at a map, a chart of some sort, you can put VFR category or type of weather, and you'll see green dots, blue dots, red dots, depending on how good or bad the weather is. So you will not I will never fly over, a bunch of pink dots or red dots where the weather's bad. If it's forecasted bad, it's known bad. I won't do that. I'm qualified. I'm ATP, commercial, all that. I'm just not going to do that, because in a single engine aircraft like a Bonanza, what I did, it was ceilings reported 600 feet. Visibility was basically 5 miles, no precip, but it was daytime. Had that happen at night, maybe I could have found the lights, but it's just not worth the risk to me.
Well, certainly it would have been a lot harder to make that tight 360 back to the runway if you'd had 200-foot overcast, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's why I think it makes sense to build margin into everything that we do. Yes, you might have the skills to fly to 0-0, but maybe something will happen. So you need to have all that extra margin in case you don't do everything perfectly.
Well, the problem is there's always the trap of I got to get somewhere. Wife's got to get home for a job. Kids got to get home for school or whatever. And so that, the reason why a lot of these accidents happen where people push their limits is because they could have stopped that chain of event from happening by just planning earlier, plan to get home a day early or do something in the planning phase so that the execution phase has less risk. And that's really the key to it. So don't plan a, Thanksgiving trip to grandma's if it takes you 2 days to get back and, there's a cold front coming through. Don't do that. Fly commercial air and fly there some other time when you got more margin on your calendar or something like that.
Yeah, I think the big trap in that is believing that you absolutely have to be back Monday morning for your work and you'll do whatever it takes to get there. I mean, that's just silly. Monday morning is going to come, and if you have an accident, you're not going to be there. So that clearly proves you didn't have to be there on Monday. So yeah, build in the extra margin and even consider, buying plane tickets and leaving the airplane where it is and fly home commercially if you really have to be there on Monday.
Absolutely.
So do you have any suggestions or advice for people on how to remain calm during an emergency and how to focus on the task at hand?
Yes, you have to train under pressure. So, in fact, I receive safety briefs every year at Navy, and one brief that I'll never forget talks about human performance under pressure, and it shows a bell curve where no pressure, the performance is not as good as it could be. Too much pressure, the performance would be not as good as it could be. And there's the Goldilocks amount of pressure where your performance is going to peak. Okay. And so you see this in a lot of the sports. You see unbelievable plays happen in, say, college basketball, tournament plays that you don't see during the regular season is because they're under pressure. And so I think when we train, you got to find a way to apply some pressure. And, what I like to do is don't fly with the Santa Claus instructor, we used to call him. You want to find that hard guy, the screamer, or the guy that's going to ding you on every little thing, because you want to feel that pressure. All right. And if, if you bust an altitude or, make an error, that's okay, because that's going to make you better and you won't do that the next time. But it's also going to teach you how to, when you're getting that situation again, how to perform. So I'm a Civil Air Patrol member, and the things I do is some of the instructors there, they're really great guys, but I don't seek the kindler, gentler guys. I seek the guys that are hammers, and I want them to hammer me on everything and be relentless. And a lot of times I'll go intimidate them because I'm a 4,500-hour military jet guy, and so I should know everything. And I tell them, no, you hammer me like, I just solo. So that's how you train for those situations, is you got to find a way to apply pressure during the training environment.
Good advice. So did you ever find out what the cause of the engine failure was?
No, but that was the first thing I was wondering once I got back home. After I landed, found a place to park the aircraft. And since I landed at Jackson International, I pulled out my phone and found a flight home. And I was actually home almost the same time as I would have been if I continued the flight. And then I started getting on the phone and on the internet. In fact, I was on the internet while I was waiting in the terminal to fly home. I was on the phone with several people who are familiar with Bonanzas to ask them if they've ever heard about this type of incident. Obviously, I called my family first to let them know I was okay. Called my mother. She tracks me on FlightAware. I called the aircraft owner. So keep in mind, I don't own this aircraft yet. I'm leasing to own. So once notifications went out for that, I got busy and ran batteries down in both my iPad and my phone doing research. And it turns out, Max, that when I post-flighted the aircraft, I saw oil coming out of the left side. So I popped the left cowl, and nothing was obvious until I did a quick scan underneath the fuel feed lines, and I saw a hole the size, the diameter. It was a round hole in the top of the engine case, about the diameter of a coffee cup, with a couple parts sticking out of it. As a matter of fact, I found, see if you can tell me, what do you think this thing is?
Well, it's kind of round and long. It's kind of spark plug shaped, but it's not a spark plug. What is it?
All right, so you see it's got a little cam.
Oh, yeah, it's got a little lobe there. Right.
It spins around. Right. So this had shot out of the top. And remember, I didn't see anything at first because it was hidden underneath the spider lines for the fuel.
Yep.
And it punched out and did not rupture the fuel lines. So it is a miracle that a piece that big punched out of the top of the engine case and did not rupture the fuel lines and cause an instant fire. All right, so now I knew that it was internal material failure. Then what? Well, one of the first persons I called is a gentleman by the name of Adrian Eichhorn, a friend of mine. Adrian,
sure, I know him very well.
Yeah. Okay. So, he's got thousands of hours in Bonanzas, and he said John, that is a 1 in a million event. I've never heard of that. He said, what you experienced is, once in a million. Never heard of that. So IO-520s were flying all over the place, and he's never heard of that. Then I got on the phone with Continental, and that can be a challenge at times, actually. Talked to a gentleman, and he said, well, we don't really know unless you give us the engine and we do inspection analysis and so on. But he says, he's of that. And usually what it is loss of lubrication. Okay, well, why is that? Well, the typical reason is people forget to check the oil in pre-flight. The other reason is there's some sort of catastrophic leak. Okay, I had 8 quarts when I post-flighted. Of course, one of the first things I did when I discovered chunks of the engine had exited the case, I checked oil level and it was showing 8 quarts. And so then he said, well, it could be a pre-detonation event. Okay, well, what is that? Well, the fuel that gets squirted into the cylinder ignites prematurely. And so you get a piston on its way up, you get an explosion on its way down, pressures meet, and it can overwhelm even the connecting rod. So that's a very rare event, but he's heard of it. And like I said, the engine was running steady state for about an hour. I hadn't touched the mixture, hadn't touched throttle, hadn't touched anything. So how could the pre-detonation event happen if I wasn't fiddling with the mixture? Okay, so the only other possibility I found online, one of my mechanics who Adrian knows, there was an event it may have been 2006, 2008 in Africa, IO-520 Bravo Alpha, just like this engine, had a crankshaft fail, and that's pretty much the strongest piece in the entire engine. But the strongest piece, the weakest part would be right in the middle, right? It's got stressors going up and down from all the cylinders. So right in the middle, if it's going to break, and that's exactly where this broke. And it turns out Continental issued a service bulletin about 1999 saying, hey, we changed our manufacturing process from arc melt process to something called a variable arc, can't remember, VAR. Okay, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a more pure forging process, therefore more strong material forgings. And so the bulletin said, you don't have to stop flying the engine, but when you overhaul it, make sure you switch out to these better, more stronger crankshafts. So I looked up the tag, got the engine logbooks, and this engine was overhauled in 2000. The service bulletin came out in 99. According to the serial number on the tag, it was a compliant crankshaft. So to this moment, I still am not 100% sure why the crankshaft failed. So there's your non-answer.
Okay, very good. I want to ask you in a moment about the work that you do currently in your current job, because I'm sure people are going to be interested in that. But before we get to that, are there any other final thoughts you have on this incident?
Well, yeah, there's one other thought. Trying to execute a instrument approach in an engine out situation wasn't anywhere in my training syllabi anywhere. I did do a tour in F-16s. They had a simulated flame-out approach profile, but I had colleagues in a society I do called the Society of Experimental Test Pilots tell me that they had European controllers train for controlling distressed aircraft that are trying to conduct an engine-out approach in IMC. They have a lot of IMC in Europe, and they actually train in that. So I would say that would be worth looking into. That would be an AA initiative, obviously. But there's no reason why instructors in the instructor world can't come up with some formalized game plan of, all right, here's what you do for, you lose the engine, your IMC, you're down the minimums. You've got options, okay? One of them isn't just to freak out. One is to kind of do what I did is, all right, we're going to head towards an area of, known, few obstacles or flat terrain or what have you, a safe area, we'll call it a safe zone. And then you can formulate an additional game plan or follow-on game plan to that. Like I did. I broke out over the numbers, and here's my game plan based on what I know, which was false. I know that runway 26 is active, and I want to avoid that. So that probably ought to be incorporated in training syllabi for both controllers and pilots sometime.
And I think related to that is always having both a plan B and a plan C in your mind in case plan A doesn't work out.
Oh, yeah. Always have a plan B and a plan C. I agree.
Okay. Very good. Well, let's see. Let's talk about the fun thing, which is tell us about what you do, because you've got a rather interesting job.
Okay. My title is a Boeing Experimental Test Pilot, and Boeing's got hundreds of pilots. but I work for Boeing Test and Evaluation. I'm a test pilot for tactical military aircraft. So I am current and qualified in all models of the F-18 and the E-18G. So the F-18 Super Hornet, high performance strike fighter that the Navy flies. And what I do in a nutshell is test and evaluate, make sure everything's working per the design and per the spec. So I'll do everything from first flights. So the first time an aircraft ever goes flying, it has been thoroughly checked. It's been ground run. It's been run on electrical power, but no one's actually ever got weight off wheels without jacks. Okay. So that's one of my tasks is to, task number one, make sure it does get up, weight off wheels. Engines are good. We check flight controls, make sure the gear goes up and locked, stays up and locked, the flaps transition as we accelerate and so on and so forth. That whole profile will take about an hour and a half. And there's probably 200 items we have to check on that profile. So there's no lollygagging during this profile. It's pretty intense. And it includes everything from first 7 minutes of the profile is we're going to go up to the service ceiling of 50,000 feet, and then we do our supersonic run. So it's advertised at 1.7 Mach. So we make sure that if you go 1.7 Mach, nothing bad happens, and we'll do that. It's also advertised to no angle of attack limits. So once we finish supersonic, we'll decelerate and go to full stall. Full stall in this airplane can be defined up to 55 degrees angle of attack, and we'll hold it there and make sure nothing bad happens. So that's really a production test pilot's job. In addition to that, we'll do modifications. So the F-18 is a lot like an iPhone. You'll get software pushes maybe every 6 months. You'll get hardware pushes every couple of years, and you keep on adding stuff. And so someone's got to fly these things in the environment it's tended to operate in and make sure it works, make sure the software doesn't crash, make sure the airplane doesn't crash. We've added on several options that keep on growing the airplane. And the whole idea is, it's a warfighting machine. So you want to make sure that you stay ahead of the threat, and your capabilities are going to far exceed the threat. So it's an unfair fight. That's the whole idea. So that's the military side. I also work on the commercial side, not current now, but I'm qualified in the 737. That also qualifies me in the P-8, which is the military derivative of the 737. And same thing, I'll be taking that up for a first flight. We check everything from the lavatory door latches, the wipers, and all the emergency systems, backup systems. We do engine shutdowns, relights, and all that. And then finally, we're a for-profit company, so we try to sell these things. On the F-18 side, we don't sell them to truly make money. We sell them, it's more of a strategic value for the United States. So we have allies currently flying the Super Hornet. Australia is one of them. Kuwait's soon to be another. And we have others that we hope will join. So I will do air shows, air demonstration flights, and customer demonstration flights for dignitaries, media types, and influential people that may be interested in Super Hornet or the Growler. So in a nutshell, I live the dream.
That's great. I'm sure there are some people right now wondering how they get your job. What advice would you give them if they want your job?
I knew I wanted to do this job about age 14. And so it was one of those visions I had, never had a doubt, never had a plan B. And so if you want the job bad enough, I'm not extremely intelligent, and I don't have gifted hands. I just work hard and I'll stop at nothing. So if someone tells me, you know what, I want you to cut my 5-acre lawn with a pair of scissors and you'll get I would do it. I would do it twice on Sunday. And so really, Max, it's perseverance. It's not about raw talent. It's not about, having a big brain with huge IQ or perfect eyesight does help. Eyesight does help, but it's really about sheer determination. So if you want something bad enough, and you're determined to, cut a 5-acre lawn with a pair of scissors to get it, that's really all it takes.
We were talking the other day, and you mentioned that on the way to the airport, your mother said something to you about flying. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, ironically, on the day this happened, where I lost the engine in the Bonanza, she's followed my aviation career, my whole life, obviously. And she asked me, just out of the blue, are you nervous when you fly? And about this quick, yep. I sure am. And she was almost taken back and shocked. And I started getting worried. Why is that? I said, because you have to be prepared for the worst to happen at the worst time, all the time. So, and I explained to her, it doesn't matter what I'm flying, whether it's the F-18, 737, or the Bonanza. I said, I'm always prepared. I'm always looking for what's going to happen. I said, it's kind of living, seem like a nerve-wracking type lifestyle, but that's what keeps me going. I guess I'm an adrenaline junkie in that respect.
Well, and certainly staying vigilant at all times is extremely helpful in your profession and for anybody who's flying.
Yeah, and I actually exercise that when I'm driving, especially nowadays with a lot of screen zombies on the road now. And it's saved me more than once. So there's a lot of benefit to that, just besides knowing what to do if something bad happens and you don't have a lot of time to react.
That's great. Well, John, thanks so much for spending time with us here today and sharing your story.
Oh, you bet. Anytime.
And my thanks to John Tougas for talking with us about his engine failure. You know, over the years, I've talked with a number of people about their engine failures, some of whom we've heard from in previous episodes. But none of them described in this level of detail their planning in advance for handling an engine failure or the rationale for each of the steps they took during the emergency. And it's clear that most pilots in the same situation wouldn't have performed as well as John did and might not have made it to the runway. Well, I hope you take away a few things from this conversation that you can incorporate into your flying so that you're better able to manage an engine failure if you should have one. And just a quick reminder, please do one of these two things today. Either share this episode with a friend and then encourage them to either follow or subscribe, depending upon the app they're using, to the Aviation News Talk podcast, or sign up to support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.